My name is Helen Ford, and I'm 67 years old, a retired school counselor living in a quiet suburb outside Denver, Colorado. From the outside looking in, my life might have seemed perfectly peaceful. Mornings with black coffee, late lunches with crossword puzzles, and evenings filled with reruns of old sitcoms and the soft ticking of a wall clock. Freedom, some would say. But inside, it felt more like a slow, polite erosion. I wasn't always alone. When I was younger, I had dreams like everyone else. Love, partnership, maybe a little cottage somewhere warm. And for a brief time, I thought I had it. His name was Alan, and he was the kind of man who said all the right things, until he didn't. One morning, without warning, he packed his things and left. For someone else, someone younger. Someone with fewer responsibilities and softer scars. That was nearly 30 years ago. After Alan walked out, I didn't chase after love. I poured every bit of my energy into work, into being reliable, dependable, needed. The students loved me. The parents trusted me. But when I finally retired, the silence came rushing in like a wave. It turns out, when your life revolves around others, you forget how to orbit on your own. Most nights, I ate alone. I watched the same news programs. I folded the same laundry, answered the same phone calls, the ones that were always brief, polite, and never personal. I thought maybe this was just how life was supposed to be in the third act. Quiet, predictable, empty. And then one rainy afternoon last November, that changed. I had signed up for a painting class at the local senior center, not because I was particularly artistic, but because I needed an excuse to get out of the house. It was drizzling hard when I arrived, and in my rush, I'd forgotten my umbrella. I stood under the awning, watching the rain turn the sidewalk into a blur, silently cursing my decision to come. "Looks like we're in the same boat," a deep voice said from behind me. I turned, startled. Standing there was a man with silver hair, a weathered leather jacket, and a smile that somehow felt both familiar and new. He held out a large navy umbrella and added, "I don't mind sharing if you don't." I hesitated. Politeness told me to decline. Habit told me to walk away. But something in his eyes, not desperate, not eager, just steady, made me pause. "I'm Franklin Bennett," he said. "Just moved into the retirement condos across the street. I used to be an architect. Now I mostly design breakfast." I smiled at that. "Helen," I replied, "retired counselor." Still good at talking too much. We walked side by side toward the parking lot, making light conversation about the weather, the class, and the squeaky floors inside the center. He didn't ask for my number. I didn't offer it. It was nothing. And yet it wasn't. The next week, I saw him again. This time, at the park near my home, tossing breadcrumbs to ducks like a scene out of a forgotten movie. We talked again. About books, about retirement, about how hard it is to find good coffee after 60. One conversation became 2, then 4, then weekly meetups at the same bench. He never pushed for more, never crossed a line. But for the first time in years, I felt like someone actually saw me, not as a neighbor or a former professional or a polite old woman, but as a person with layers, with history, with value. Franklin was a widower. His wife had passed away 10 years earlier from breast cancer. Since then, he'd been alone, not bitter, just quiet. "Life didn't turn out the way I planned," he once said. But then again, whose ever does? That line stuck with me. We started spending more time together, grocery store runs, walks through town, silly debates about whether strawberry jelly was better than grape. It is. I didn't even realize I had started smiling more. Sleeping better? Cooking again? It wasn't romantic, not yet. But it was something. A warmth I hadn't felt in decades, a slow thaw. And somewhere in that slow unraveling, I came to a startling realization. Maybe I wasn't too old for love. Maybe I had just been too afraid to look for it again. Sometimes the second chapter doesn't start with fireworks. Sometimes it starts with sharing an umbrella in the rain. Franklin and I never had a formal conversation about what we were to each other. There was no dramatic declaration, no whispered promises under starlight. Instead, we simply kept showing up, like clockwork. Every Tuesday, he'd bring bagels, always sesame for him, cinnamon raisin for me. Thursdays were for errands, where he'd grumble good-naturedly about grocery prices, and I'd pretend not to notice how he always carried the heavier bags. On Saturdays, we sat on that same worn bench in City Park, sipping coffee from the little vendor cart that served it too strong and too hot, just the way he liked it. We weren't dating. At least, not in the traditional sense, but we had become each other's person. And for the first time since I retired, my days didn't feel like blank pages anymore. They had color again, sound, laughter. I found myself humming in the kitchen, leaving my porch light on, just in case he walked by. There was a new rhythm to everything. One evening, he invited me over for dinner at his place. "I hope you like pot roast," he said, "because it's either that or burnt chicken. My cooking skills peaked around 1987. His condo was modest but warm. A few framed sketches of old buildings on the walls, piles of books on side tables, a cozy mess that felt lived in. Safe. I noticed a photo of a woman in a navy blue dress on the mantel. "That's Carol," he said when he saw me looking. "My wife. She passed in 2013. She used to make this exact roast, only better." I didn't say much. I just gave him a small smile and nodded. We ate slowly, the kind of meal that didn't need background music or candles to feel meaningful. Afterward, we sat on the couch drinking tea, letting the silence settle. Not heavy, just full. Then, without warning, Franklin looked over at me, expression serious. "Helen," he said softly, "what would you think about living together?" I blinked. "Not in any pressure kind of way," he added quickly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not marriage, just companionship, a shared roof, someone to talk to in the morning, someone to come home to." I froze, tea halfway to my lips. My heart thudded like a drum out of sync. I hadn't expected this, not tonight, maybe not ever. He must have sensed my panic because he chuckled nervously and waved a hand. "Forget I said anything. Joke. Just a dumb old man running his mouth." But it didn't feel like a joke. I spent that night lying awake, the question looping in my head. Not because I didn't care for him, I did. More than I'd let myself admit. But because I was terrified. Terrified that accepting his offer meant risking everything. The peace I'd rebuilt, the solitude I'd made my armor, and worst of all, the chance that I might lose him too, just like Alan. But another voice whispered back, "What if you don't lose him? What if this is the chapter you've been waiting to live?" The next morning I texted him, "I think I'd like that. Let's try." A week later, I moved into Franklin's condo. We didn't play house, there was no pretending. We simply built a routine, 2 mugs by the sink, 2 pairs of shoes at the door. We started cooking meals together, sharing the news out loud, arguing about crossword puzzles and whether the dog down the street really needed to bark every night at 10 p.m. Franklin had a heart condition, something he managed with medication and a stubborn refusal to slow down. I kept an eye on his pills, made sure he ate more greens than bacon, and gently reminded him that he wasn't 40 anymore, no matter how much he swore he could still shovel snow in one go. He once turned to me and said, "You know, with you around, I feel like I might just outlive my own doctor's prediction." He was kind like that, not grandiose, but intentional. Every time he stepped out, he'd come back with something. My favorite honey, a pack of crossword books, sometimes just a single white daisy in a napkin. I'd never had anyone remember the little things before. He didn't try to fill the silence with noise. When I had bad days, he sat beside me quietly. When I got sick with the flu, he stayed up all night reading by the lamp just to make sure I didn't need anything. And just like that, friendship became something else. One morning, I was folding laundry and I realized I was humming again, not because I had to, not because I was masking sadness, but because I was happy. And then the phone rang. It was a voice I didn't recognize at first, clipped, cautious. "This is Jason Bennett," it said, "Franklin's son. I heard you've moved in." My stomach dropped. He hadn't called to welcome me. He had called to question me. Jason didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask how Franklin was doing either. He opened the conversation like a cross-examination. My father's been on heart meds for nearly 6 years now. Did you know that? Yes, I answered quietly. And you moved in… when? A week ago. There was a long pause. Then, with a tone so cold it could have iced over spring, he said, I hope you understand how serious this is. My father is not a young man. He's vulnerable. I'm aware of that, I said, doing my best to remain calm. That's why I make sure he takes his medication every morning. You're not his nurse, he snapped. No, I said, I'm not. I'm his companion, his friend, someone he chose. Another silence, but this one wasn't heavy. It was strategic. I'll be coming by next week, Jason said. We need to talk, face to face. When the call ended, I sat frozen in Franklin's kitchen, staring at the chipped mug I'd just filled. For a moment, I felt 16 again, not 70, being judged by someone who hadn't seen the journey I'd walked, only the destination he didn't approve of. I told Franklin about the call later that night. He was reclining in his favorite chair, the one with a worn-out armrest from years of elbow leaning. He didn't look surprised. Jason's protective, he said gently. He's been that way ever since his mom passed. He's got this idea that anyone new is a threat. I tried to smile. Well, I must look awfully threatening with my floral blouses and orthopedic shoes. But he didn't laugh. Instead, he reached over and took my hand. I'll talk to him, he said. I should have done it sooner. Jason arrived on a chilly Sunday afternoon, 3 days earlier than expected. He drove a black SUV and wore a tailored coat like he'd stepped straight out of a boardroom. His handshake was firm but reluctant. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the condo like he was taking inventory of everything I'd touched. I offered him coffee. He declined. I'm not here for pleasantries, he said. Understood. He looked at Franklin, seated beside me. Dad, do you really think this is wise? You're letting someone you've only known for a few months move into your home, share your finances. What if she hasn't touched $1 of mine, Franklin interrupted, voice suddenly firm. And she doesn't need to. I invited her here. She didn't ask for anything. Jason turned to me. I've seen this before. A lonely man, a charming woman, a few smiles, a few home-cooked meals, and the next thing you know, she's got access to your accounts, your health records, your property. My heart dropped. I am not that kind of person. He didn't flinch. No one ever says they are. Franklin stood, slowly, but with purpose. Son, he said, I appreciate your concern, but you're speaking to someone I care about, someone who has been here for me every single day, not once a month when it's convenient. Jason's expression cracked for just a second. Surprise? Hurt? But he covered it quickly. This isn't about feelings, he said. It's about protection. Then protect what matters, Franklin said quietly. And maybe, just maybe, that includes my right to choose who I spend the rest of my life with. Jason didn't respond. He just nodded stiffly, turned to me, and said, I'll be watching. I hope I'm wrong, but if I'm not, don't expect silence from me. When he left, Franklin and I sat in silence for a long time. No TV, no music, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant creak of the floorboard under the hallway rug. He finally spoke. I'm sorry, he said. I wish he saw you the way I do. I'm not here for his approval, I replied, but I won't lie. Being accused of something I'd never even imagine, it stings. Franklin reached into the drawer beside his chair and pulled out a small folded note. I started writing this weeks ago. Meant to finish it soon. I took it in my hands. It was a draft of a trust agreement listing me, Helen Ford, as the beneficiary of a living trust. My breath caught. Franklin, he smiled faintly. It's not about money, it's about peace of mind. If something happens to me, I want you protected. I looked at him, tears brimming but not yet falling. Love, at this age isn't measured by rings or ceremonies. It's measured by who shows up, who stays, and who prepares for the day they no longer can. It was the third winter we'd spent together. Franklin had just turned 70, and though he never liked to make a fuss about birthdays, I insisted on baking him a small chocolate cake. We laughed that night over candlelight, not because it was romantic, but because we couldn't find the matches and had to light the candles using the gas stove and a metal spoon. He told me, "I don't need anything else, Helen. This is all I ever wanted." I didn't know it then, but those would be the last words he ever said to me. 3 weeks later, Franklin's heart gave out. It happened fast, too fast. One moment, he was walking across the living room, humming some old jazz tune. The next, he collapsed in my arms, his breath slipping away before the ambulance even arrived. The silence that followed was so loud I could barely hear myself think. I didn't cry at first, not at the hospital, not at the funeral. I just stood there, staring at the pine casket, feeling like someone had ripped the roof off my world and left me standing in the cold. Jason cried, big, dramatic sobs that shook his shoulders. People patted his back and whispered about how much he must have loved his father. No one looked at me. The woman who had slept beside Franklin for 3 years, who had memorized every one of his medications, who had been the one to hold his hand as he took his final breath. After the burial, I returned alone to the home we'd built together. I made tea with shaking hands and curled up in his chair, wrapping myself in his old gray sweater just to feel something that hadn't left me yet. The next morning, Jason arrived. He didn't knock, just opened the door with a key I hadn't realized he still had. I was sitting on the floor, sorting through old photo albums, my heart still numb. "We need to talk," he said, standing like a judge in the doorway. I looked up. "About what?" He didn't mince words. "This house belonged to my father, and now legally it belongs to me. I'll need you to move out by the end of the week." My breath hitched. "Jason," I said, barely able to speak. "We lived here together for 3 years. I took care of him. You weren't married," he interrupted coldly. "There's no legal document binding you to any of this. No will, no title. You're not family." "But he was writing a trust. He told me." "There's no signed trust filed anywhere," he said sharply. "I already checked with the county and his lawyer. If something existed, it was never finalized. So as far as the law is concerned, you're a guest. And now your stay is over." I stared at him, stunned. "You think I was using him?" He didn't answer, just crossed his arms and added, 3 days. That's me being generous." I stood up slowly, knees trembling but voice steady. "You don't have to believe in what we had, but I won't be bullied in the name of grief." He smirked. "Call it what you want." Jason turned and walked out without another word, leaving the door wide open behind him. 3 days later, I packed everything I could fit into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box. I took Franklin's sweater, a few photos, and the book of poetry he used to read aloud when my insomnia crept in. The rest, I left behind. Just before I stepped out, I paused at the doorway and looked back at the framed picture of him on the wall. His smile, soft, content, a little crooked, seemed to whisper an apology I would never hear aloud. "I'm sorry too," I whispered back. "But I won't let this be the end." I returned to the small home I hadn't lived in for over a decade. It was dust-coated, silent, and far too empty. I spent the first week cleaning it from top to bottom, not out of motivation, but out of desperation. If I kept my hands busy, maybe the grief wouldn't take up so much space in the room. Nights were the hardest. Without Franklin, the bed felt like a canyon. The air seemed colder. The walls seemed to echo with memories I hadn't even made in this place. I survived on coffee, toast, and the numb repetition of survival. Days blurred together. Time became something I passed through, not something I lived in. 2 months passed before I finally opened the drawer where I'd kept the draft of Franklin's trust. I unfolded the yellowed document with shaking hands, eyes scanning for hope. But where his signature should have been, there was only a faded smudge and a red stamp I hadn't noticed before. Revoked, under review. My chest tightened, My fingers trembled. What happened? He told me he was going to file it. Why would it say this? And then, like a thunderclap, a cold realization crept in. Jason. I had already lost the man I loved. Now, I was about to lose the last proof he ever meant to protect me. I couldn't breathe when I saw that red stamp. Revoked, under review. My fingers tightened around the draft of Franklin's trust, the only remaining proof of what we had. And now even that was slipping through my hands like sand. I sat at the edge of my old bed, the room spinning. I remembered the night he showed it to me. His eyes steady, his hand trembling slightly. "It's not about money, Helen," he'd said. "It's about peace. I want to know you'll be okay, and now, revoked?" I didn't want to believe it, but something in my gut told me exactly where to look. I grabbed my coat and walked straight to the bank. If there was anything left in the account Franklin had mentioned when we discussed the trust, maybe it would still be there. Maybe there was a clue. The teller greeted me politely and asked for my ID. When I handed over my passbook, her fingers paused mid-type. She looked up. "Would you mind verifying your balance, ma'am?" I nodded absently, expecting a small figure. I hadn't checked this account in over a year. She slid the passbook back across the counter. When I looked down, my breath caught. $238,900. I blinked. Not a few thousand. Not even 20. Nearly $250,000. My knees went weak. This can't be right. She tilted her head. The account receives quarterly deposits from a living trust, has been for about 3 years now. My eyes stung. I barely managed to ask, "Who's the trust holder?" She typed, then paused. "1 moment, please. I'll get the financial manager." 5 minutes later, a tall man in a navy suit introduced himself as Mr. Grayson, the bank's estate specialist. He led me into his office and pulled up the trust records. "Yes," he confirmed, adjusting his glasses. "This account was created by Mr. Franklin Bennett. The beneficiary is listed as you, Ms. Ford. It's part of a living trust he established in 2020. It was frozen briefly after a medical review was submitted, but resumed shortly after." "Frozen?" I asked. "Why?" Mr. Grayson turned the screen toward me. "A claim was filed by a third party, someone named Jason Bennett, citing concerns over Mr. Bennett's mental competency. Medical documents were submitted to challenge the trust's legitimacy." My stomach turned. He knew. Jason knew about the trust, and he tried to erase it. I pressed my hands to the desk to keep from shaking. "Is there anything I can do?" He nodded slowly. "You'd need to request a full legal review, possibly file a trust litigation suit, but first, you'll want to speak with someone experienced in estate law." That night, I didn't sleep. I dug through every drawer, every folder Franklin had ever touched. Bills, notes, receipts, until I found it. A worn leather envelope labeled in his handwriting, "For George, in case anything happens." Inside was a photograph of Franklin with an older man, arms slung around each other like brothers. On the back, it read, "George Talbot, witness to trust signing." My heart leapt. The next morning, I called the Legal Aid Center and explained everything. A woman named Marcia Daniels, a retired attorney who volunteered there, agreed to meet me that afternoon. She had kind eyes but a razor-sharp mind. After listening to everything, she looked at me and said, "We'll take this step by step. And if that man truly witnessed Franklin's signature, we've got a shot." She pulled out a legal pad and began strategizing like a seasoned general. "First, we'll petition to retrieve the original signing footage from the law office. Then, we need to find George. If he's alive and willing to testify, we can prove that Franklin signed that trust of sound mind." "But what if Jason destroyed the footage?" I asked. Her jaw tightened. "Then we prove motive. We expose the false evaluations, and if necessary, we take this to court." 2 days later, we found George. He lived in a small apartment building near the edge of the city. When I knocked, he opened the door just a crack, eyes clouded but still sharp. "George," I said softly. "It's Helen, Franklin's Helen." His grip on the door tightened. "I know who you are." I explained everything. The revoked trust, the medical claims, Jason's involvement. At first he was quiet. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. "I remember that day," he said. Franklin was sharp as ever. He even joked he needed my old eyes in case the fine print tricked him. I watched him read every page before he signed, twice. Tears sprang to my eyes. "Would you be willing to testify?" George looked me in the eye and nodded. I made him a promise. If anything ever happened, I'd tell the truth, no matter who didn't want me to. It wasn't just about inheritance anymore, it was about honor, his and mine, and no one was going to erase either without a fight. 3 weeks after George agreed to testify, we were in court. Marcia moved quickly. With her guidance, we'd filed a trust litigation suit, formally challenging Jason's efforts to revoke the trust Franklin had set up in my name. The court accepted the case, and a hearing was scheduled faster than I'd imagined, mostly because Marcia emphasized Jason's possible misuse of medical documents to freeze assets. The judge didn't take that lightly. That morning, I wore a gray wool coat and carried nothing but a folder of documents and a photo of Franklin in my purse, not because it would be submitted as evidence, but because I needed to remember who I was fighting for. Jason was already seated at the plaintiff's table when we arrived, dressed in a sleek charcoal suit that didn't suit his worn face. He didn't glance at me, just kept tapping his pen against the table like he had better things to do. The judge, Honorable Meredith Langston, a stern woman in her 50s, called the room to order. Her presence alone silenced the shuffle of papers and the whispers along the benches. "We are here to determine the validity of the trust filed under the name of Franklin Bennett," she stated, "and whether claims of mental incompetence at the time of signing bear legal weight." Marcia stood first. "Your Honor," she began calmly, "we submit the original signed trust, quarterly bank statements showing consistent deposits, and a video-recorded testimony from George Talbot, the witness present during the trust's execution. We also include letters Franklin wrote expressing intent to protect Ms. Ford should anything happen." She handed over a file. The judge flipped through it, nodding slowly. Then it was Jason's lawyer's turn, a polished man named Mr. Kellerman, all charm and cold eyes. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "we submit psychological evaluations from Lakeside Medical Center, signed just 3 months prior to Mr. Bennett's death. These records suggest declining cognitive function. We argue that the trust was filed during a period of impaired judgment and therefore should be rendered void." Marcia stood again. "If I may," she said, "we've since obtained confirmation from Mr. Bennett's primary care physician at Ridgeview Clinic, not affiliated with Lakeside, stating Franklin showed no signs of cognitive impairment at the time the trust was executed. Furthermore, we believe the evaluations from Lakeside were submitted with the sole intent of freezing the trust's assets." The judge raised an eyebrow. "That's a serious accusation." Marcia didn't flinch. "Yes, Your Honor, which is why we've also filed a motion for further investigation into the validity of those records." Then came the moment I had dreaded and longed for all at once. Marcia played George's recorded testimony. There he was, seated in his old chair, wearing a clean shirt, voice shaky but firm. "I was there when Franklin signed that trust," George said. "He read every word twice. He cracked a joke about needing my help if he missed something. He looked me in the eye and said, 'George, I just want to make sure Helen's safe. Jason won't understand, but I have to do this.'" The courtroom was still when the video ended. Jason's lawyer stood quickly. "This man is nearly 80. His memory isn't reliable." Marcia responded without missing a beat. "Perhaps, but would you like to explain why your client personally removed the original trust video from the law office archive?" The room stirred. Mr. Kellerman shifted. Jason visibly tensed. "The office log clearly shows Mr. Jason Bennett requested the footage for review purposes and never returned it," Marcia continued. "And it just so happens that shortly after, medical paperwork was filed to suspend the trust." Jason stood, fists clenched. "I was protecting my father." The judge banged her gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Bennett." And then, the final blow. Marcia pulled out a handwritten letter dated a week before the trust signing. It read, "George, if anything happens to me before this is official, I just want someone to know I meant it." Helen doesn't expect anything, but I want her protected. I trust her. I love her in my own quiet way. Please help her if I can't." The judge read it silently, lips pressed tight. Then she looked up. "This court finds sufficient evidence to determine that Mr. Franklin Bennett was of sound mind at the time the trust was established. The trust is declared valid. The motion to revoke is denied. All assets are to remain in Ms. Ford's name, per the original terms." She paused. "In addition, the court will open an inquiry into the possibility of medical fraud and document tampering by the plaintiff. Case adjourned." Jason didn't look at me as he left. He just gathered his papers and stormed out of the courtroom, shoulders hunched, head down, not in grief, but in defeat. I sat motionless, Franklin's photo still in my purse, heart pounding. Marcia leaned over and whispered, "We did it." And finally, after months of being silenced, I spoke aloud the words I'd held inside. "Thank you, Franklin. You didn't leave me behind. You led me here." The courtroom victory wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. A week later, I sat in a sterile office at Denver Regional Medical Center watching the surgeon circle dates on a wall calendar. "We need to move fast," he said gently. "The cancer is still in the early stages, but we don't want to wait." I nodded. The same money Franklin had left to protect me from losing my home would now protect something even more precious: my time. I scheduled the surgery for that Friday. The night before my admission, I sat at the kitchen table with my little black ledger, the one I used to track bills, grocery lists, and idle thoughts. On the last page, I wrote, "I use the money you left me to put myself back together. Now I want to fix something for someone else." The operation went well. There were complications, of course. Recovery is never easy at 70, but I woke up with sunlight streaming through the window and breath in my lungs. And that was enough. During recovery, the world slowed down. I spent long afternoons watching the wind rustle through the trees outside my window. I started writing again, not poetry, not letters, but plans. Something had begun growing inside me, just as real and insistent as the cancer once had been. I wanted to build something for people like me. People who'd been overlooked, dismissed, or forgotten once they were no longer useful. People who had stories but no one to tell them to, questions but no one to answer, hearts still full of love but no one left to offer it to. I called it Golden Second Chance. The idea was simple: a small community project offering free legal guidance, emotional support, and a quiet place to land for seniors, especially widowed retirees, those living alone, or anyone fighting to keep their dignity in a world too fast to notice them. Marcia helped me with the paperwork. She brought in 2 retired attorneys and introduced me to a local health clinic willing to partner. I cleared out my guest bedroom and turned it into a cozy meeting space. A couple of folding chairs, a coffee machine, and a lot of heart. Our first visitor was Mrs. Lorraine, a soft-spoken woman in her 80s whose son was pressuring her to sign over her home. She didn't understand the papers. She was scared. And she had no one. I made her tea. We sat for 2 hours. When she left, she hugged me so tightly I thought I'd fall apart. That's when I knew. I hadn't survived for nothing. I had survived to serve. It was a crisp afternoon in early fall when I saw him again. I had just stepped out to take the trash when I noticed a figure standing beneath the old maple tree at the end of my street. Slouched shoulders, faded hoodie, a canvas bag clutched tight like it held his entire life. Jason. He didn't approach right away, just stood there like a man deciding whether to knock or walk away forever. The next morning, he was sitting on my front steps. When I opened the door, he didn't look up. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said hoarsely. "I've got nowhere else to go." I stared at him for a long moment. Not out of anger, but out of awe. The man who once tried to erase me from Franklin's life now looked like a ghost of his former self, tired, broken, and carrying the consequences of his own decisions. "What happened to your job?" I asked quietly. "Gone. Someone tipped them off after the hearing. My wife left. My son won't speak to me. I lost everything. He looked up, eyes bloodshot. I'm not asking for anything. Just a place to sleep, just for a little while. I didn't move, but I didn't close the door either. You'll take the guest room, I said after a long pause. 3 months. No more. You help yourself. You clean up after yourself, and you speak to no one in this house with resentment or shame, including yourself. He nodded slowly. I understand. I handed him a fresh towel, a warm blanket, and a bowl of soup. Not because he'd earned it, but because I finally had the strength not to let his past hurt me anymore. Over the next weeks, he barely spoke. He helped around the house. He cleaned the porch without being asked. He even attended one of the senior center workshops to help an old man apply for housing. One night, as I was washing dishes, he lingered in the doorway. I used to hate you, he said flatly. I thought you came for his money, but now, I see. What he gave you wasn't about money. It was about love. I turned, dried my hands, and nodded. And you? I asked. What will you do now? I'll try, he whispered. No promises. But I'll try. And with that, he left the next morning. No goodbye. Just a note. You gave me something no one else would. A second chance. I won't waste it. I smiled, folded the note, and placed it in the same drawer where Franklin's trust used to be. Because now, I had something better. A legacy. Not of money, but of mercy, and the courage to begin again. Life doesn't end when things fall apart. Sometimes that's when it truly begins. Helen's journey reminds us that even in the later chapters of life, there's still room for healing, love, and purpose. She faced betrayal, grief, and injustice, but she didn't let any of it define her. Instead of shrinking under loss, she chose to stand up, speak the truth, and protect her dignity. The most powerful lesson here is this. Starting over isn't about youth, it's about courage. Whether you're 37 or 70, you still have the right to draw a line, to say, I deserve better, and to build a new life from the pieces left behind. And more than that, you have the power to help others do the same. Forgiveness in this story isn't weakness, it's clarity. Helen didn't forgive Jason because he earned it. She forgave because she was strong enough not to carry bitterness anymore. And that's real freedom. So no matter how late it feels, no matter what you've lost, remember, you are never too old for a second chance.